topics and opinions expressed in the following show are solely those of the host and their guests and not those of W4CY Radio, its employees, or affiliates. We make no recommendations or endorsements for radio show programs, services, or products mentioned on air or on our web. No liability, explicit or implied, shall be extended to W4CY Radio, its employees, or affiliates. Any questions or comments should be directed to those show hosts. Thank you for choosing W4CY Radio.
Well, welcome to the show. Bill Martinez here. Great to have you with us, sharing a part of your day. I don't know about you, but this whole climate change discussion, it's kind of a debate. For those that believe in climate change, it's inarguable. It's a fact, they say, which isn't even a scientific term, by the way. But nonetheless, I believe it's something that we need to we need to talk about this. We just cannot accept somebody just thrusting this theory upon. It's a theory, okay? Basically, it's still a theory. And meanwhile, we've spent something like, I don't know, $6 trillion plus. $6 trillion of the people's money we've spent on, battling climate change. I kind of feel like Don Quixote chasing windmills just a bit here, because there's some things that just don't seem to match up. I don't know, call me stupid. I went to school and I actually paid attention in the classroom. I took notes, and what they want to tell us doesn't square up, because I've been told, at least I was taught, that, carbon dioxide was a good thing, because that's what the plants needed to breathe, because then they gave us what we needed, oxygen, so that we could live. It's kind of the circle of life. But suddenly, little did we know that that was a problem. So what are we looking forward to? Are we looking forward to, all the plants and trees dying in the universe, all in search of managing the climate, as if God didn't know what he was doing when he, constructed everything? But, we've got these brilliant scientists today in the 21st century that somehow know better than God. Well, Steve Goreham is going to be joining us in just a moment. He's got a new book called Green Breakdown. He's a speaker, author, and researcher on environmental issues, energy, and public policy. And he warns of the coming renewable energy failure. Now, if you think wind, solar, batteries can replace the hydrocarbon fuels that power our modern industrialized society, then you need to pay attention here, okay? Because he'll break it all down. Green Breakdown shows why the net zero agenda of forced transition to renewable energy is not only costly, it's dangerous and destined for failure. Using science. Oh, yeah, that science thing. Sometimes, the inconvenient truth of it all. Economics and in-depth analysis. Steve exposes the weaknesses in the planned green energy transition and predicts a coming renewable energy failure. Welcome, Steve Goreham. Good to have you with us. Well, we're a little bit, there we go. Hey. We just had to get the mouse moving, and there he's, Shazam, he appears. Well, Steve, welcome to the show. Good to have you. By the way. Right. Well, thank you. So, Steve, help us out here, because, we've got two narratives and they seem to be in conflict. And, in the science community, generally, we welcome a robust conversation, because, in the past, we found that we've been able to arrive at an intelligent conclusion. But right now, it seems like half of the people participating in this discussion, they want to ignore and cancel altogether.
Steve is having technical difficulties.
Okay, I get it.
He'll be joining us again.
Okay, so he's got mouse problems. If something about that mouse, it has to be moved. If it's not moved, it hangs up on us a little bit here. So, well, let's see. Steve, are you there yet? Well, I guess he'll pop up when he's ready to pop up. But, lots of questions to ask of Steve here, questions that you have in your mind in terms of, climate change. Is it real? Is it perceived? What is it? And where is the disconnect taking place to where we can't have a reasonable conversation? Because I can tell you, as a kid growing up, I grew up in California, and it was the smog would be so bad, even though I grew up on the coast. So where it really got bad is when we had to go, toward Los Angeles. As we got towards Los Angeles, I was on a traveling baseball team with American Legion, and we would go, and the environment was so bad, the smog was so bad that we would get what they called smog cough, and the only way that we could begin to even manage it was we had to. We had to bring oxygen tanks, believe it or not. We had oxygen tanks in the dugout in order to play a pick and baseball game. That's how bad it was. But, the thing is that, the environmentalists, energy, oil refineries came together and they found a solution by working together. And yes, I mean, California pays a little bit more for gas, but I'll guarantee you they're happy to pay a little bit more. Right now, it's a lot more, and it's crazy. That's a whole nother problem. But as far as solving the problem in handling the environment, I give them kudos and say, hey, you did a great job. We didn't have to bring oxygen tanks into the dugout anymore, and we were able to play. But this is when industry and environmentalism can come together here and, make things happen. Oh, here we go. We got Steve back on with us. Steve. Okay.
I'm very sorry. I don't know what happened.
Well, we're on now, so we're going to make the most of it. So let's not move anything. Let's go. Okay. So Steve, right off the bat, help us understand where we are in this discussion, with climate and carbon.
So, as you say, people talk about the climate, and they use phrases like climate change is real.
Mm-hmm.
But I've never met a person who doesn't think the climate changes. I mean, everybody knows that. The real question is what causes the change in Earth's temperatures, what causes the change in the warm times and the cool times. And overwhelmingly, the evidence appears to be natural factors, not man-made emissions.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's where the rub is. And as you say, the world is spending about $1 trillion a year on renewables to try and get to something called net zero by 2050. Net zero is the idea that we need to eliminate carbon dioxide emissions from all of our processes. And we do that from everything, our transportation, our home heating, our heavy industry, our utilities. Each person exhausts about 2 pounds of carbon dioxide every day.
Mm-hmm.
So by the way, I should say this is the wealthy nations of the world. United States, Europe, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and a few others are pushing toward this net zero thing. And whatever we cannot reduce, they want to capture so-called carbon dioxide capture and storage. But this is beyond a reach out. This is worse than a hope and a prayer. Mm-hmm. We are never going to get to net zero by 2050. Everything we do is based on hydrocarbons. Wind, solar, and electric vehicles can't make up for that.
Right.
And so this is all going to come down to a crashing failure.
And meanwhile, as we go through this, as we've been going through it already for a couple of decades, Steve, how much pain down the road as we get closer to 2050 are humanoids going to have to endure with this, with this program?
Yeah, we have to endure a lot. Europe just had what I call the first transnational energy crisis based on green energy over the last 2 years.
Uh-huh.
And they have natural gas prices that are 4 times the price in the United States. Their electricity rates are 3 or 4 times as high. They have now established temperatures in buildings. You can only lower your temperature so much in the summer and raise it so much in the winter. In England, they're talking about don't bathe so much to save energy, or shower with a friend, which sounds amusing, but their energy bills in the winter are $2,000 or $3,000 each winter for a residence, very, very high. So. Yeah. These are not simple things. In the U.S., we've had blackouts and we have rising electricity prices. And this is going to have a big impact on society, as you say.
Well, the fact of the matter is coal is cheap, and it is what drives the world. And so, and the biggest offenders, you could say, of the environment would be, just right off the top of my head, China and India. and they don't seem very interested in complying with. I mean, they'll sign a Paris Accord agreement with their fingers crossed, but they have no intention because they're still trying to, they're trying to industrialize themselves, and they realize that coal is key to this. And meanwhile, they're almost laughing. I got to imagine they're laughing in the back rooms going, what a bunch of idiots, chasing these windmills. We'll just say, we'll support their idiocy and let them go. But meanwhile, we're going to move forward with coal.
Well, you're right. There are both China and India get more than 60% of the 60% of the electricity with coal. Mm-hmm. And we have a situation today where 700 million people in the world do not have access to electricity, and another 2 billion people have daily blackouts of their power. And so we need low-cost energy for the rest of the world. By the way, if you live in the world's people. Mm-hmm. So we really need to find a way to solve real pollution problems, not carbon dioxide. And we still need to rely on coal and natural gas and nuclear for much of our power. Those are the sensible alternatives.
Steve, let's just say, okay, let's go down this pipe dream of net zero. Even if you get down to 2050, this is kind of the impossible dream, because carbon is so much a part of the planet. How do you negate it totally? I think it's a fool's errand if I'm understanding this correctly. Am I off here?
Well, just for some numbers, in transportation today, 91% of the world's transportation is fueled by fuel from petroleum, mm-hmm. Primarily natural gas and gasoline. There's another 3% that comes from natural gas. We get about 3% from biofuels and about 1% from electric. So we're talking 94 or 95% mm-hmm. from hydrocarbons today. If you look at electricity worldwide, it's roughly 60% of the world uses electricity from hydrocarbons. If you look at our airlines, 99% from petroleum fuels, shipping, 99% from petroleum fuels. Our heavy industry, steel, fertilizer, plastics, cement, mm-hmm. concrete, use huge amounts of hydrocarbons and emit huge amounts of natural gas. And there are no replacements for these in the short term. And so net zero is bound to fail. And to the extent that we push it, we're going to have some big problems with costs and impacting our citizens.
Even more than we're already experiencing, right? I mean, because we're already investing, like I said, we put in $6 trillion, and I don't see the ROI in it. But I guess the powers to be, ROI is irrelevant, because those who are capturing those funds, at a different pay grade and level that you and I are on, they're fine, they're fat and happy, and they just keep pushing, this theory and scaring people along the way. Because I mean, to me, the first thing that comes to mind when somebody has to scare you into a decision, that sends up serious warning flags for me, Steve.
Yeah, you're right. That's a very sad thing. We have many government leaders, the United Nations, the International Energy Agency, that raise the specter of man-made warming to get certain policies approved, and it is a scare campaign. So that's a problem. But you're also right. There is no end result with all of this. Mm-hmm. Pursuing measures to reduce global warming is sort of like building a hospital and never serving a patient, or raising an army and never taking a hill.
Right.
Nobody ever talks about how much temperatures are going to be reduced, or how much variations in droughts and floods are going to be reduced, or how many more polar bears we're going to have if we do all this stuff. They just say, well, you got to reduce carbon dioxide emissions. We all know that's true. But again, there is no end result, as you say. And it's probably, when you break down the greenhouse effect and all the measures of trying to control greenhouse gases, it's very unlikely we're going to have, even though we're spending $1 trillion a year, mm-hmm. very unlikely that we're going to have any measurable difference in global temperatures.
Well, I want to bring up this one slide about hurricanes in the 20th century. Uh, some
Yeah.
people would think that, human CO2 emissions is causing hurricanes to become more frequent and stronger, as the headlines would suggest. Address that if you would, Steve.
Yeah, we just had Hurricane Idalia about a month and a half ago come across the panhandle of Florida. It was a strong storm, Category 3.
Mm-hmm.
And all the headlines from USA Today and CNN and NPR and others were talking about how this was caused by our carbon dioxide emissions and that storms are getting stronger. But if you look at the actual data, that is not the case. We've had about 300 hurricanes make landfall in the United States since 1850. And about a third of those are Category 3, 4, or 5. And then we've had 12 years when we've had multiple strong hurricanes. Landfalls of hurricanes and data from NOAA, we get about 2 hurricanes every year that come ashore, but
Mm-hmm.
that used to be about 2.1 a year. Now it's about 1.9. In any case, to decline. So the data doesn't support that sort of fear.
Well, and how are they able to get away with this kind of faux information? I mean, they lose credibility, whether we're talking about healthcare, other things where these scientists come up with these things that, at the end of the day, I think are quite manipulative as opposed to intellectual, so that we have an understanding that as much as would count on us, I mean, nobody wants to sit there and blow up the environment. We want to be good stewards of it, but, let's deal with the reality of it as opposed to, some sort of control mechanism.
Well, I think there's a natural inclination of the media to take these wild stories and run. In July, we had a scientist come out with a paper that said that was the warmest month in 180,000 years. And it was trumpeted all over the world press. This is the warmest month in 180,000 years. It was flat out wrong. I mean, there's oceans of data saying that our times now are not particularly warm, but this guy came out with this and they ran with it. There's another guy,
Steve, what was his credibility? On what basis could he make this statement and have so much acceptance by the mainstream media? Was it just, he said the right thing, it fit their agenda, so let's run with it?
I think that's part of it. And then it's sensational, it grabs headlines and people read it. But let's talk about history a little bit of temperatures. So we're in a moderate warm period right now, but temperatures haven't warmed very much. In the last 140 years, they're up 1 degree Celsius, about 2 degrees Fahrenheit in 140 years. That's about the temperature change you get every morning between 9 and 10 a.m.
Right.
But if you look back 1,000 years ago, it was warmer 1,000 years ago when the Vikings settled Southwest Greenland, and there were trees in Southwest Greenland at that time. There aren't any today. They're just scrub grasses. It was warmer 1,000 years ago. It was warmer 2,000 years ago when the Romans conquered the Mediterranean in those short skirts.
Yes.
And at that time, they were growing olives in what became Germany, north of Rome. It was warmer 4,000 to 8,000 years ago. Today's climate is not historically warm. We have had many multi-century long periods in the last 10,000 years when it was naturally warmer than today. Matter of fact, there's a one piece of evidence in an ocean is the Rhone Glacier in Switzerland. Mm-hmm. If your viewers have been there, they may have been to the Rhone Glacier. It's a big glacier. It goes wall to wall between 2 mountains. And the Rhone River is sourced there, flows out into France and down into the Mediterranean. But that glacier's been receding for about a century as we've had a general warming. Where the glacier pulls back, though, they find things like wagon wheels and they find horse bridles and they find 4,000-year-old wood. A scientist by name of Christian Schluter estimates that for 6,000 of the last 10,000 years, there was no ice at this location. There was no glacier here because it was naturally warmer. Mm-hmm. So we have all these headlines saying the planet is boiling and all this crazy stuff, yet it's not as warm as we've had many times in the past.
Well, speaking of which, let's talk of the polar ice caps. That's always one of Al Gore's favorites. Where are we with the polar ice caps?
Yeah, the polar ice caps have receded a little bit in the last 50 years. Well, I should say the North Pole ice has receded.
Mm-hmm.
It's been down about 15 or 20%. The Antarctic ice, though, is pretty stable. It's about where it has been the last 20 or 30 years. Well, actually, since they've had satellite measurements about end of the 70s. So the ice caps have been down a little bit, but again, there's many indications that that it was they were bigger in the past. There's a plane called the Glacier Girl, which during World War II, this plane was flying to England. It was a P-40, and it was flying by the way of America, and then Eastern Canada, Greenland, Iceland, and England. It was caught in a storm and had to crash land on the surface of Greenland. But then expeditions went back 40 years after World War II, tried to find it. They couldn't find the plane. And finally, they used subsurface radar, and they found the plane was buried under 67 feet of ice. So all this ice had accumulated in 40 years on this plane, and indicating that the ice is shrinking near the edges of Greenland, but it's getting thicker in the center. And again, these are very small changes relative to the overall ice caps.
Exactly. Well, let's talk about every time there's a storm, the headlines go, it's climate change. So address what seems to be the perception of stronger storms globally.
Right, there is much of that. But again, the data from NOAA and the National Climatic Data Center don't show that. In the United States, we get about 90% of the world's tornadoes. Mm-hmm. Canada gets another 10%. Based on, we have this Gulf of Mexico and some mountains that create these situations. But the strong tornadoes have been declining since the 1960s and 1970s. We had more strong tornadoes during those days.
Right.
Scientists also track all of the global tropical storms, tropical cyclones. They've been looking down in the last 50 years with satellites and tracking every tropical storm on the surface of the Earth. And they can also measure the wind speeds of these storms. Mm-hmm. And this produces two curves. One is the number of tropical storms around the Earth at any one time. And there are typically in any 12-month period.
Right.
And in any 12-month period, there's about 90 of these storms. And then the number of hurricanes, which are stronger. There's typically about 45 in any year period. But when you look at the graph, you don't see that there are more tropical storms or more hurricanes. Mm-hmm. And the graph that you're showing also is a measure of storm strength. Because if tropical storms are getting stronger over time, more of them would get to be hurricane level wind speeds, but it isn't happening. So the data just doesn't support the idea that we're getting stronger storms.
Again, when you have empirical data like what you're showing us, Steve, are the scientists not embarrassed by the data?
Well, it is remarkable that they're not speaking out, but there's a bias. There is a bias in the scientific press. Just in early September, a climate scientist by the name of Pat article in New York Post, and the title is, "As a scientist, I'm not allowed to tell the full truth about climate change." And Mr. Brown went on to say that if he was going to get an article published in Nature or another scientific journal, it had to conform to the narrative of dangerous climate change. If he didn't put that in there, they would not accept this article. And he was writing articles on forest fires. And so that is the situation we've got right now. There's no challenge to these wrong articles, like 180,000 years warmest. Yeah. And the articles that are going in are biased. Very unfortunate.
Yeah, it is unfortunate. It dumbs us down, and of course leads us, based on the wrong information, We're supposed to be the consent of the governed. Well, how can you have proper informed consent if you have all this false narrative out there? And meanwhile, you have a government that says, oh, we need to have a czar of disinformation, when they are perpetrating it themselves, and they seem to be the greatest purveyors of it. I mean, even to the point, as you know, Steve, just like what this one scientist is saying, if he was relying on research money, for example, he would have to comply. If he doesn't comply, well, the scientific community that, controls the government or dollars, which is us. I mean, it's our money, taxpayers' money. They're telling them, you better comport to this narrative. If you don't, you're not going to get another research paper.
Well, you're right. Money is a big factor. It's unfortunate, but a lot of science and a lot of climate science is funded by the U.S. and other governments. In my second book, The Mad, Mad, Mad World of Climatism, I quoted a computer modeler, and he basically said it requires $50 million to set up a climate modeling team using a supercomputer, and about $20 million a year to run it. We have 30 of those teams across the world. So you're talking several $1 billion that is being paid to these computer modeling teams to give forecasts on climate change. And oh, by the way, if one of those teams says, well, I think climate is dominated by natural factors, as you say, it's very likely that their funding would dry up.
Yeah.
So
yeah, they'd find another team to replace that team real quick. You better believe it.
I do think people are sincere when they say they think we see dangerous global warming. But again, the science and the evidence don't support that. And you're right, money plays a big role. We also have industries that have sprung up because of this. Wind, solar, biofuels. We have deans of sustainability at every college. We have vice presidents of sustainability at corporations. And the U.S. government is spending vast amounts of money. The money going to renewables during the Obama administration was about up to $15 billion a year. It came down to about $7 or $8 billion under Trump, and now it's backed up to 15 or 17 billion a year under Biden. And the Inflation Reduction Act is going to push that to $40 to $50 billion a year in subsidies and grants going to people for wind, solar, and biofuels, hydrogen, and a bunch of other things. The amounts of money are just vast that are going into this.
Well, and the thing is that everybody has to take the pill and check in your intellect in order to go along with this, because the only thing that's being sustained here is their income and their way of living. And we, the people, are paying, for this false science that, I don't know, a couple generations up the road, when they look back and start looking and analyze what's going on with climate change, go, what were these people thinking? And, Steve, is it too premature? I mean, we've been studying, climate change. And like I said, we've invested in excess of $6 trillion on this. Is it too premature to say that we should have some sort of adjustment on this, that we've learned something, concrete, other than, this, what, seems to be a false narrative?
Yeah, it is really amazing. A few years ago, they tried to set up a red team and a blue team, I think, in the U.S. government to kind of counter argue about the climate. That did not happen, though. But we're just marching down. It may very well cool for a few decades here. Very difficult to predict what's going to happen with global temperatures. We have been having warming since about 1975. But prior to 1975, we had a cooling period from 1940 to about 1975.
Right.
And when I was young and leaving college, a lot of people were worrying about a coming ice age.
Yes, exactly.
And we have scientists now that say we're likely to go through some period of cooling, not necessarily an ice age, but temperatures may stop rising for 2 or 3 decades. And if that does occur, it's going to be very, very difficult to support the narrative that human emissions are causing all this warming.
Do these guys really know this, or are they probably just a step above a fortune teller? I mean, I don't mean I don't mean to be disrespectful, Steve. And it just seems to me like, it's just like you get these people who have a scientific title and they hold their finger up in the air and say, "Oh, yeah, it feels like cooling." I mean, it just seems weird to me.
A plausible theory. We do have a greenhouse effect in our atmosphere. Sunlight enters the atmosphere. What isn't reflected by clouds is absorbed by the surface of the Earth. And then the Earth gives off lower energy infrared radiation, which is invisible to our eyes.
Mm-hmm.
As that tries to pass out into space, almost all of that is absorbed by greenhouse gases in our atmosphere. Those gases then re-radiate that energy, and that does tend to warm the surface of the Earth. But the thing that people don't know is overwhelmingly the greenhouse effect is a natural effect. When I speak to audiences, I ask them the question, what is Earth's dominant greenhouse gas? And many people answer carbon dioxide, others will answer methane, but the answer is water vapor.
Yeah.
Water vapor causes somewhere between 70 and 90% of Earth's greenhouse effect, water vapor in clouds. And then the last quarter of the effect is mostly due to carbon dioxide. But again, most of that is caused by nature, that CO2. The oceans have 50 times as much carbon dioxide as the atmosphere, and the oceans are always releasing carbon dioxide and absorbing it. When plants die, they release carbon dioxide. When they grow, they absorb it. But every day, nature puts 20 times as much carbon dioxide into the atmosphere as all of Earth's industries and removes about the same amount. So when you roll that all together, you've got the natural effect of water vapor as the biggest greenhouse gas by far. Right. And then you have all this natural CO2 going up in the atmosphere. Human emissions are only about 1 or 2% of Earth's greenhouse effect. Very, very small. So that means if we eliminate all those emissions, we may not be able to see the difference in global temperatures.
Right. Exactly.
And that's the story that is never told in the news articles and rarely discussed by scientists in the press.
Or the next thing, if you follow their logic, you start eliminating human beings.
Well, there are some people who have advocated that. In my third book, Outside the Green Box, Rethinking Sustainable Development, I talk about what I call the four horsemen of the environmental apocalypse, which are climate destruction, resource depletion, global pollution, and the fourth one is overpopulation. And it's quieted down a little now, but in the late 20th century, we had people like Paul Ehrlich, who basically said that hundreds of millions of people are going to die from starvation because of overpopulation. Never happened. We had many people predicting that the population was going to get too big. But what happened? Global population the fertility rate of women used to be about 4 or 5. Every woman would have 4 or 5 kids on average. Right. Now that's come down to about less than 2.5. As societies get wealthier and we don't have infant mortality, kids aren't dying, we have women entering the workforce, and these family sizes go down. Matter of fact, we have more than 70 nations now where population is declining, and it's a big problem in places like China and Japan, South Korea, and places in Europe.
Right.
So a lot of these scares that get into place, like overpopulation, don't seem to bear out when we go through time.
Exactly. And there are, the eugenicist movement and people who are well known to echo that sentiment that the earth cannot sustain. I mean, they were saying couldn't sustain 2 billion. We're now at 8 billion and projecting not too far down the road to be looking at 10, 12 billion. I got to imagine their imaginations are exploding on them because they just cannot understand the ingenuity of humanity and how it steps up. Because when you look at some of the problems that we've had worldwide, especially when it comes to food scarcity and stuff, so much of that happens to be controlled and manipulated by outside political forces. Not necessarily that, the planet cannot sustain it. It's usually interference by government. I mean, look at China right now, the problem they're having with their population, which I think is a huge issue, Steve, where you got so many men and not enough women. I don't know if the Chinese are going to have some sort of Sadie Hawkins event where they're sending their men out to capture women so they can mate with them, because there's not enough females in China.
Well, and part of that is the population, the overpopulation fears. In the 60s and 70s, the World Bank and the United States and others would not lend money to developing nations of the world unless they showed how they had population control. And we had people in many places. In India, they were rounding up young girls to get them sterilized. China had an estimated 300 million abortions and 300 million forced sterilizations.
Unbelievable.
The 1970s through the 1990s. And you're right, now their population is falling. They have too many men. We also had indigenous people in South America that were singled out. Not the ruling classes, but the indigenous people, for population control. So very, very sad history. But again, this is something that society does as it goes through a natural evolution. They start having less children as they get wealthier, and when children live past their infancy. But nevertheless, all the intellectual world leaders told everybody they aren't smart enough to control their population. We have to force them to do this. And that's sort of the same attitude today with climate change.
Mm-hmm.
The elites of the world say that we got to force everybody to drive electric vehicles or to stop using coal, stop using natural gas, those sorts of things.
Right, because they've had a success record in their short history of life where they have done this and they've been successful with it, right? Surely
not quite.
Yes.
Matter of fact, it's kind of interesting too. The best correlator of human prosperity is carbon dioxide emissions. We've had a big rise in carbon dioxide since the World War II that's being emitted from our society, but we've also had declining infant mortality, expanding lifespans, more people getting education, gross national product growth in all these areas. So those hydrocarbon fuels really are great for society.
Yeah, exactly. We're talking with Steve Goreham, his book, Rain Breakdown, The Coming Renewable Energy Failure. Steve, some people would say that, global temperatures, they're at an all-time high. I mean, the headlines tell me that, and this is the thing I find myself asking people sometime when they come up with statements like that. I say, well, who told you that? Do you know that for a fact?
Yeah, that's really not correct either. We've had a gentle warming, about 1 degree Celsius in 140 years. But you look at the U.S., for example, and there's data right in NOAA. They call it, there's a state extremes database where they look at the record hot temperature for states, the record cold temperature, rainfall, all sorts of things. And when you look at that, you find some interesting things. If you look at the 50 state high temperature records, you find that 23 of those 50, almost half, were set in the decade of the 1930s.
Mm-hmm.
Real head scratcher. Yeah. 36 of the 50 records were set prior to 1970. And some particular cases, California, the record was in 1913, Minnesota, 1970, Maine, 1911. Most of the Midwest was set in the 30s or the 50s. And so we got everybody going, wow, we just had 105 degrees. It's really terrible, but they don't know that the record for their state was 118 and it was set 60 years ago.
Right.
So these are the data is there if people will take a look and not read the headlines. But if you read an article on climate today, the odds are that it's probably wrong if you read it in the press. So we just need to ask additional questions on all of this.
Well, Steve, where can we go? I mean, for those inquiring people that really want to know, because, we've clearly pointed out that, whether we're talking social media, anything that's affiliated with the current elite class, it's sadly going to be disinformation because they are bought and sold, so to speak, right?
My position is a bit of a minority report. The overwhelming part of society, more than 50% anyway, is in fear of man-made global warming. I would suggest my 4 books. The first 2 are on climate. The next one's on sustainability. The last one is on the renewable energy transition. In all of those books, I have many, many sources, either books you can read in bibliographies, or you can go to websites that are really very, very good and will give you the clear story. But again, we eventually the science and the economics are going to win out here. We're going to get back to sensible energy policy. People are going to demand a return to low-cost, reliable energy.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, I mean, you think of where we are right now with inflation. Some would say we're already in a recession. Some economists are saying that we will realize it fully in 2024. It'll be inarguable. We'll see. The goalposts seem to be moving on that. But the fact of the matter is one of the greatest exacerbators of inflation was when we surrendered our energy independence, and Joe Biden killed coal.
Well, we're actually still doing pretty well with energy independence. We are still the leading producer of oil, natural gas, propane, which we ship to Asia, so people don't have to burn dung in their houses for cooking fuels. But wherever we've put in these green policies, our prices are going up. California, for example, in the last 3 years, passed up all of New England in terms of electricity prices. They now have prices that are twice as much as any Western state, and they're second behind Hawaii in electricity prices. We also have wherever we put in wind, we have electricity prices rising faster than the national average. Those are places like Iowa and Kansas, California, Minnesota. They put in all these wind turbines, and you got to build transmission out to them, and they're intermittent, which you got to handle. And so you have rising prices of electricity, and that's going to continue the more that people want to put in intermittent wind and solar.
Well, Steve, help us reconcile what you just said, because I've heard this before. The Biden administration says, hey, we're producing more, everything is really good in the energy sector. But the question remains, why are we paying so much for it then?
Yeah, we're paying more and more. I think it's because of green policies. Another thing is blackouts that we might, when you build all these intermittent wind systems, you have trouble keeping the lights on. Let me read a quote from a commissioner with the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, a guy by the name of Mark Christie. He testified in front of the Senate in June, and I'm quoting him, "I think we're headed for very dire consequences, potentially catastrophic consequences in the United States in terms of the reliability of our grid."
Right.
And he basically said, we're retiring coal and in some cases natural gas too fast. And so we're already seeing some of those blackouts. We had one in Texas in February of 2021. Electricity was off for 72 hours to 4.5 million people. And estimates are that up to 700 people died from that blackout. We've also had blackouts in Oklahoma and in California.
Now see, this is the thing, Steve, that drives me nuts. You got 700 people die because of these policies, and who goes to jail? Is anybody accountable for this?
Well, they aren't really. And as a matter of fact, ERCOT, who is the electricity
supplier
regulatory group for Texas, they had dozens of insurance companies sue them for several tens of billions of dollars because of this. And it was struck down by the courts. ERCOT is protected. Apparently, you can't sue them for this kind of thing. But they made some big mistakes. They assumed electricity demand was going to be a lot lower than it was. I've actually communicated with a board member on ERCOT. And unfortunately, it was a big tragedy. But across the United States now, and data from the Energy Information Administration, in 2012, 2013, each ratepayer had an average outage of the year of 3 hours. But now we're getting an average outage in the US of 7 or 8 hours a year. So the blackouts are rising. They've more than doubled in 10 years, and they're going to get worse and worse and worse until people say, hey, enough of these intermittent renewables.
Exactly. Well, there's a slide up there, if we can get this one up, about power prices increasing faster in wind states. That doesn't seem like that should be the case, right?
Right, because you get all the headlines on how wind and solar are cheaper.
Mhm.
You're talking about a slide that I show when I present. I plot the 14-year percent price increase for the top 12 wind states, and in 8 of those 12 states, the prices have risen faster than the national average.
Mhm.
National average is up about 27% in the last 14 years, but places like Kansas, California, Minnesota, Nebraska, Washington, all higher. And the reason is, and you've got the right chart there, the reason is that you have to build transmission out to these remote wind sites, which is expensive.
Right.
And then you have to back up the systems for when the wind doesn't blow. So you have to keep most of the traditional coal, natural gas, and nuclear plants still operating, ready to back up. So the more we put into these wind and solar, the more it's going to cost people, and particularly low income people who have a high percentage of their income going to utilities.
Well, Steve Goreham, author of the book Green Breakdown, The Coming Renewable Energy Failure. Steve, we've got about 3 minutes left. I want to give you the opportunity to, again, explain to our audience this green breakdown, what you mean by this, and what we can anticipate, let's just say in the next couple of years.
Right. So it's going to take more than a couple of years, I think, but the wealthy nations of the world are driving toward net zero by 2050. That means putting in a lot of wind and solar and use biofuels in transportation, try and use hydrogen for heavy industry. This is beyond a wish and a prayer. This is going to be impossible to do. We're going to have 4 big impacts. First is higher energy prices, higher electricity prices wherever we continue to push renewables. We're going to have electricity blackouts. We're going to have less freedom. We haven't talked about that much, but that means they want to take away your gas stove, take away your gasoline car. And we're going to have transnational energy shocks like we've seen in Europe over the last 2 years. Over the next decade or decade and a half, the world is going to push back. We're seeing some of that in Europe now. People are going to demand a return to low-cost, reliable energy and not expensive intermittent renewables. And so that's what I'm calling a green breakdown. We're going to get back to what makes sense.
Well, that's what I was just going to say. It seems like which would be refreshing, and that would be a move, a revolution heading back to common sense.
It would be, but the green world is pretty well entrenched, as
Yes.
you know, and it's just going to take some very tough situations. But we've got places like New England, very heavily dependent upon natural gas that's imported.
Mm-hmm.
They actually have a shortage of natural gas. We have other places like California, Pennsylvania. They're talking about having shortages, and so we're going to have these problems. Anyway, if people have if they have a gasoline car, if they have a gas stove, if they use electricity, they really ought to look to get a hold of Green Breakdown. They can learn what's really going on with these things and what's in store for many of us.
Yeah, it's like you said, they've had such a stranglehold on the minds of citizens, and it's going to take a concerted. It has to be a concerted effort to push back, to elect people into office that can affect, positive, policy changes that make sense. I mean, this is where a guy like Donald Trump, for example, is so antithetical to the green movement, right?
Yeah, well, I call this, as in my first 2 books, I call this climatism, the fear of man-made global warming. And both Mr. Trump and Mr. Ramaswamy are now using the term climatism.
Mm-hmm.
And it's an ideology. It really is. It's become it's become the center of focus for environmental groups, the center of what many of our government leaders are telling us, but it's based on a false premise that humans are causing dangerous global warming. And the second false part about it is that we can stop it by putting in all these renewables, and that's not going to happen as well.
Mm-hmm. Well, and like you said, anytime you're in a situation when you have to compel people to do something, I mean, the cumulative intelligence of 340, 50 million people, I'll side with them every time, as opposed to, several dozen elites who live on the theory and think that they know better. Steve Goreham, I cannot thank you enough for coming on. Again, remind people how they can get their hands on all your books. This one here, of course, we've been talking a lot about Green Breakdown, The Coming Renewable Energy Failure. But the other books as well, where can they get their hands on those, Steve?
Yeah, my books are at Amazon. There are ebooks as well for the last 3. Ebooks are on Apple and Google and Amazon and Barnes and Noble. And then you can also get a signed copy of any of my books from my website, Steve Goreham, GOREHAM.com.
Well, Steve Goreham, thank you so much. I appreciate all the insight and the help on the issue of climate change, and I look forward to, continuing the conversation with you. Okay.
Great. Bill, I'm always at your service.
You got to take care. Steve Goreham. Our thanks to Steve for being with us today. For more information and to be a part of this mighty movement to return to God and common sense, right? And to save our country, go to BillMartinezShow.com. May God bless you and keep you and make his face shine upon you. May he be gracious unto you and give you peace. Go and be blessed. Thank you so much for being with us.